So at the very least, we could move towards a moderately beneficial form of capitalism, but it's still capitalism, still based on the principle that certain people are masters who give orders and others are servants or slaves who follow the orders. That's called having a job. Having a job means spending most of your waking hours in a condition of subordination to a master that Stalin never achieved. Stalin couldn't tell you at 3 o'clock you can go to the bathroom for 5 minutes, or here's the clothes you have to wear, or here's the path you have to take from this point in the warehouse to the other point. And Stalin couldn't do that. But that's the life for most people. That was bitterly opposed for millennia, back to classical Greece and Rome. It was recognized that there's no assault on human rights and dignity harsher than being subordinated to a master. Of course, they excluded slaves, women, poor, and so on, but that was the principle. And that was the guiding principle for working people in the early Industrial Revolution, right through the 19th century. Well, finally sort of gotten beaten out of their heads. But that's something that's not far below the surface, should be revived. Why should you take orders from a master most of your waking life? There are other ways to organize. Production can be organized by the workers. You can have cooperatives, collectives of various kinds. In fact, working people and farmers in late 19th century America, vast majority of them, wanted to create what they called a cooperative commonwealth, where the people themselves would cooperate to organize work, life, communities without masters. Well, it was crushed by plenty of violence and also by plenty of ideology, doctrine, imposing Gramscian hegemonic common sense. And now it's regarded as a peripheral position, but it can come forth.
People are, I imagine, usually struck when they hear these kinds of ideas about wage slavery, at least in this country. And I highly recommend to anyone who's listening who's not familiar with it, a talk you gave in 1970 called Government in the Future, which I found very useful, where you trace a lot of these ideas we're talking about, kind of given, demonstrate an exposition of classical liberalism in von Humboldt, and basically make the argument that liberal ideas in their essence, though not in the way they developed, are profoundly anti-capitalist. So in this book, Professor Waterstone speaks a fair amount about Marx, and you do talk about wage slavery. I'm wondering, what aspects of Marx's work do you find useful, and which aspects do you find not so useful?
I've preferred to quote classical liberals, people like John Stuart Mill, leading intellectual figure of the 19th century, highly regarded, one of the most honored intellectuals. His view was that in a properly ordered society, there should be no masters and no servants. Production, social life should be organized by the participants in a democratic, participatory fashion. That Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party are the ones who used the term wage slavery, not Marx. American workers had never heard of Marx when they picked this up. This was the Republican Party, considered it intolerable, except as a temporary measure till you become free. Now, Lincoln and the Republican Party talked about individual freedom till you become individually free. But the working people and farmers in the United States were talking about collective freedom in a cooperative commonwealth, far beyond the Republican Party or even classical liberalism. Well, I think those are ideas that we should resurrect. There's plenty to learn from Marx. For me, the most, at least personally, the most important parts are the historical analyses, which are pretty insightful. And many of the concepts, fundamental concepts like alienated labor, exploitation, and so on, which incidentally were fairly common coin in the late rationalist, early romantic period. People like Humboldt, for example. For Humboldt, just to pick one of his aphorisms, he said, if an artisan creates a beautiful work on command, we may admire what he did, but will despise what he is, namely a tool in the hands of others. And Humboldt's aphorism that nothing is more important than to allow the full flourishing of a person's capacities in every aspect of life. That was taken by Mill as the epigraph from On Liberty, his famous work. So this runs right through our own history, right through our own tradition. I quoted Adam Smith repeatedly, who was anti-capitalist in his fundamental sentiments and perspective. So just take a look at the famous words, invisible hand, which you study in every economics class. Do you study the way he used the term? Well, it's pretty easy to find out. He used it twice in any relevant sense, so not hard to find. Once in Wealth of Nations, once in his other major book, Moral Sentiments. In Wealth of Nations, he's discussing international trade. And he says that the merchants and manufacturers of England might make greater profit if they bought from abroad, sold to abroad, but their commitment to their own country would lead them to prefer to invest and produce and consume at home. So as if by an invisible hand, England would be spared to be anachronistic, what we call neoliberal globalization. That's one use. The other use is in Moral Sentiments, where he discusses kind of a thought experiment. What would happen if it's an agricultural country, if one landlord accrued almost all the land to himself? He said, well, wouldn't matter too much, because the landlord, because of his concern for others and his desire to be admired by others, would make sure to distribute his property so that everybody would be pretty well off. So as if by an invisible hand, we would get relative justice. Is that what you're taught in economics classes? Is that capitalist ideology? Not exactly. Those are the two uses.